Hello, I'm Amanda Walker, and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing America right now. The attempted assassination of Donald Trump and the reshaping of the political moment. The attack on the former president marks one of the most serious incidents of political violence in recent US history. Coming up, we'll examine the worrying rise in these kinds of acts.
When violent events occur, we tend to see approval of violence in the public increase. And so the way that we respond as an electorate to a violent event is to say, well, maybe violence is okay.
I proudly accept your nomination for president.
We'll also look at what this historic moment could mean for the election campaign and November's outcome.
Very scary. I am afraid that it could happen again, and the fact that there was a breach in this modern day is not okay.
Now, America is no stranger to these types of incidents. Let's take a look back at some of the most prominent. The attack on Donald Trump is the latest in a long history of political violence in the US. In 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot dead as he attended the theater.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be...
Nearly 100 years later, John F. Kennedy was killed as his presidential motorcade drove through Dallas, Texas.
I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
5 years after that, his brother, Robert Kennedy, was killed on the campaign trail. In 1981, Ronald Reagan survived an assassination attempt after giving a Union speech at a Washington hotel. Congresswoman Gabby Giffords also survived an attempt on her life after she was shot at a constituent meeting in 2011. The angry rhetoric of more recent years has inflamed the increasingly polarized political climate. In 2017, Republican Steve Scalise was shot at a congressional baseball practice. In 2020, the FBI foiled a plot to kidnap Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
I have asked specifically from this White House to bring the heat down. I have asked the Republican leaders in our state legislature to bring the heat down.
The husband of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Paul Pelosi, was attacked with a hammer inside his home in 2022. This latest act of violence comes at a time where people are left wondering what happens next. And that question is worrying a lot of people. We may have been here before, but rarely in such volatile times and right in the middle of a toxic political campaign. Do you worry about this creating a climate of violence?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know if it's creating it, it's there. The fear is there. Our nation isn't where it was a few years ago.
It's very scary. I am afraid that it could happen again, and the fact that there was a breach in this modern day is not okay.
You know, I get the feeling that, because it's so divisive and things like that just happen, I don't know why we seem to normalize this stuff, but, it's kind of scary. You may not want to be out with your wife and kids and, have your MAGA hat on going down the street just for fear of what some random unknown may come out of it.
It's being normalized.
Oh, very much so, which is super sad.
In recent years, there has been a surge of threats against elected officials across the US. Data shows that political violence is on the rise. Liliana Mason is one of the political scientists at the center of that research. I started by asking her, as an expert, what her first thoughts were when she heard about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump.
I was very worried. One thing that we found in our research is that when violent events occur, we tend to see approval of violence in the public increase. And so the way that we respond as an electorate to a violent event is to say, well, maybe violence is okay. More people think maybe violence is okay.
Really? So are we in danger of normalizing violence?
Well, this is the real, I think the real threat here is the possibility of a sort of cascading effect where violence occurs, approval of violence increases, another violent event then becomes more likely, approval goes up even more, and we could end up in a vicious cycle, which can always get to a tipping point where we lose control of whether violence continues happening or not.
And in terms of the research, I really want to dig into the research that you've done and the data that it's presented. But it seems to be a trend that when Trump is perceived to be under threat, violence increases. Tell me more about that.
Right. So first of all, FBI statistics have shown that over the last 10 years or so, violent domestic terrorism, but political violence in general is coming from the right wing more than the left wing. So significantly more political violence when Trump is around comes from the right wing. When we think about Trump himself, we ran some experiments where we asked people to read a quote from Trump or Biden saying violence is never acceptable, ever. And what we found was that simply reading that one quote from either Trump or Biden reduced people's approval of violence. So leaders have a lot of power to allow their supporters to take a step back and reassess. If they don't do that, though, then we see more violence occurring. And so their leadership is actually really important. The other thing that I'll say is that we've been tracking approval of violence in the electorate since 2017. And what we found is that during both of Trump's impeachments, Republican approval of violence shot up. And also there has been a very worrying trend in the last few years of elected officials, election administrators and judges and their staff receiving a lot of threats. So they're not actually violent acts, but they are very violent threats. And that has largely been coming from the right.
Obviously, this was an extremely high-profile attack, but these things are going on across the country on a much more regular basis, aren't they, when it comes to local officials, as you say, being threatened? What do these threats, this intimidation, what form do they take?
So most of these threats are anonymous, and it's very hard to find the perpetrator. The only data that we have is from asking the elected officials to tell us whether they've been threatened. But we have an increasing amount of data on this. And what we're finding is that the numbers of both elected officials and sort of people who work in the system, the political system, the number of those people who have been threatened has doubled, tripled, quadrupled, sometimes quintupled over the last 5 to 6 years.
Really?
And I guess the good news about that is that these threats have not really been acted upon. So there haven't been actual violent acts against most of these people, but they're receiving death threats to themselves and to their families, often to their children. And it is extremely intimidating, and it's very hard to ask someone to stay in a job where their children are being threatened with violence and death. And so there is an effect that we have seen of people being intimidated out of their jobs. They just stop doing those jobs. And the people who are targeted tend to be women and people of color, overwhelmingly. And so what that's doing is changing the makeup of who runs our government and who makes democracy work. We're eliminating women and people of color from those spaces because those are the people who are being threatened the most.
There is research out there as well that suggests that support for political violence increases when people believe that the other side supports it. Tell me more about that.
So we've asked a number of different questions about violence to Americans, just sort of a random sample of Americans. Usually what we see is about 10 to 20% of Americans approve of political violence to some degree, which is not a lot. I mean, it's too many, but it's still
pretty surprising though that anyone approves.
Right.
That
says that it could be.
That's a few million people, right?
Oh yeah, it's the equivalent of a few million people. So, but then if we then say, well, what if the other side is violent first? What if people in the other party are violent first? Then do you approve of violence? And that number then goes up from 10 to 20% to 40 to 50. Some of our most recent data I just looked at this morning, up to 60% of people saying it's okay to use violence if they start it. And that's what we're really worried about, is this type of retribution cycle happening where once someone feels attacked, they feel much more able to attack back.
You touched on it at the beginning, but the language that is used by leaders, and we know that Donald Trump, it's out there, we've heard it, does use much more violent language than Joe Biden. If Donald Trump stopped doing that in the next 4 months, what kind of election campaign do you think we might have? Would it be more peaceful?
It would make me feel better about the chance of violence emerging.
So what he says and doesn't say would have an actual impact.
Very much matters. And the problem is that he doesn't, when violence does occur, he doesn't come out and say, stop it. I don't like this. I don't want any of my supporters to do this. That's what we should be hearing from a responsible leader. And usually we do hear people like Joe Biden say, this is not part of a democracy. This is not who we are. This is not how we do things. We have a democracy in order to have a peaceful transition of power. And the peaceful part is very important. And so any responsible leader is trying to present that latter message of, this is about maintaining a peaceful transfer of power. And by attacking your political opponents, you're disrupting democracy itself. Trump never says that. And often, or if he does say it, it's sort of under duress because something really terrible like January 6th is happening. And at that point, he only told people to stop after many, many hours of them taking over the Capitol and defiling, all kinds of American symbols and icons. What I would say is the fact, there's so many examples of Trump reacting to violent events in an encouraging way, of him saying, either in his rally to say, like, you guys should go attack that protester, or even with when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, he made jokes out of it. He really belittled the entire situation. And of course, January 6th is like the best example of this, where he just refused to tell people to stop. And in fact, there are quotes from people inside the Capitol who were saying, someone said, on video, someone said, should we stop? And the other one says, Trump hasn't told us to stop. And so they keep going. So we have real suggestive anecdotal evidence that Trump himself could have stopped that violence, which is the most terrifying, I think, political violence that we've seen in America in a very long time. And he just tends not to do that. And so there's the violent atmosphere that we see is partly a result of a political leader of one of our two parties not condemning violence when it occurs. The most important, what I try to do when talking about political violence is to, first of all, explain that it's a serious problem and it's very frightening. But we don't want to tell people who are part of a democracy to feel frightened about participating in their own democracy. And in fact, the total number of people who do violent things is vanishingly small. And so the vast majority of our democratic system is very, very safe and works the way it always works and will work the way it always works in November. And so we have very brave Americans who are working in elections, who are volunteering their own time to help our democracy work. We have people whose entire job it is to run elections freely and safely. And all of those people are doing their jobs right now. And so the fact that this is a frightening thing, it's important for us to know about, but it shouldn't intimidate Americans out of participating in their own democracy, because it's not very many places. And we have a responsibility to support our own democracy, to participate in it, and to have our voices heard. And we don't want people to be scared away from that by a couple of violent actors.
So the data is there. Political violence and support for it is growing. But who's fueling it? In the aftermath of the attack on Donald Trump, Republicans flipped the script and blamed Democrats. Joining me now to discuss the discourse and the impact on the election campaign is NPR radio host Todd Zwillich and staff writer at The Hill, Caroline Vakil. Thank you both so much for braving this brutal DC heat. I want to start with you, Todd. How would you summarize the reaction from both sides after the attack on Donald Trump?
On the Democratic side, as long as we're going to put this in the context of political party, if you like, the instant reaction to this horrible event, almost an event without precedent, at least in the last 40 years, was pretty traditional, especially on social media. Alarm, calls to tamp down the rhetoric, pleas for the safety of Donald Trump, violence has no place in our discourse, some of the things that you would expect in a moment of horrific national political violence. On the right, largely, and this is the main difference now between the two sides when it comes to this. There are people, certainly, on the internet, on the left. There are trolls everywhere. There are people who were celebrating the violence or making poor jokes or justifying it in some way. On the right, the reaction was completely different. From elected officials in Congress, from people with institutional power in Congress, what you saw was an immediate sort of a capitalization on this moment to celebrate Donald Trump's position as a tough leader, to retweet pictures of his pumped fist, to talk about confrontation, and then in the second immediate aftermath, elected officials, including J.D. Vance, Marjorie Taylor Greene, another congressman from Georgia, and many, many others, instantly blaming Joe Biden and Democrats for an attack with no evidence whatsoever. Even to this day, we have no idea the true motivations of the shooter. We have no evidence whatsoever who's to blame or whose rhetoric, if any at all, influenced his decision to execute this horrific act. We just have no idea, and it was utter disinformation coming from elected officials on the Republican side. And that's the key difference between the parties now, is the institutionalization of that inflammatory rhetoric in a moment of violence. It's very different.
They seized on Joe Biden's use of the term putting Trump in the bullseye, but really some false equivalence there, right?
Not only is it false equivalence, first of all, a couple of things to know about that statement. Joe Biden made that statement on a private call to donors. He didn't say it on television. He says he regrets saying it. There is simply no evidence that the assailant ever heard that statement, had any notion of that statement. There's no evidence that this assailant was acting with political motives at all. So to point to that statement and say that it led to the shooting is simply a statement without context. It begs the question and demands the response of the rhetoric and violent rhetoric promoting violence from Republicans going back to Donald Trump's rise in 2016. The list is long. We can talk about it if you want, but to focus in on one statement by Biden, which he probably shouldn't have made in private, the idea that that is what's to blame for the most proximal outrage, I think just belies evidence.
Caroline, what have you noted about the way the Trump team has responded? I think something that struck me certainly in the convention was this tough guy idea, that the tough guy has now become even tougher. I mean, that's a pretty strong message for those voters who value that.
You know, the phrase Teflon Don, you know, we thought about it in the context of these indictments that he was receiving and faced and grappling with this year, or last year too. But, you know, the idea now that he's survived an assassination attempt, I think only bolsters him in terms of the eyes of Republican voters. And you also juxtapose this with this, you know, idea that Trump is also trying to kind of, in some ways, try to lower the temperature now and call for unity. You know, he reached out to Nikki Haley, for example, asking her to speak at the RNC. And so I think there's this interesting juxtaposition. He's, you know, the campaign team is, you know, seizing on this as a moment of saying that this is a man of strength, but at the same time trying to rally around the troops while there has been, you know, existing and lingering division within the Republican Party.
I was going to ask you both that. So we heard Trump in the immediate moment after the attack, fight, fight, fight. Then he's calling for unity. Which Trump are we going to get in the next 4 months? Is it going to be the latter, or is that more instinctive, perhaps, former going to dominate?
I think it really depends on Trump, frankly, and what tone he sends. You know, he has sometimes wavered on certain positions like, you know, absentee and mail-in voting, and, you know, has kind of waffled on certain positions. So it's really going to be up to Trump in terms of setting the tone. But certainly I think this is, for some skeptical Republicans like Nikki Haley, welcome right now that he is trying to bring in folds of the party that felt like they had been sort of pushed to the sidelines during the GOP primary.
Todd, what do you think? We're going to see Trump the fighter or Trump the unifier?
I have no idea what Donald Trump is going to do over the next 4 months. The script is unwritten. None of this is written. Donald Trump has a track record, however, and it is not one where he sticks to the discipline that his advisors advise. Trump has to be Trump, and he has a track record. It's long, and when it comes to political violence, it's rather sordid. Donald Trump told the Proud Boys in a debate in 2020 to stand back and stand by. He regularly jokes and laughs about the attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of the former Speaker of the House, who was nearly beaten to death with a hammer. He jokes and laughs about it at his rallies. There was a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, the Democrat Gretchen Whitmer. Trump has called that attack fake. He spent the 2016 campaign encouraging his supporters to fantasize about a time when they could punch protesters in the face, or encouraging cops to fantasize about the times when they were allowed to abuse suspects. The list goes on. Even within the last couple of weeks, Donald Trump tweets and reposts images of Joe Biden hogtied and bound and gagged in the back of a pickup truck. This is a normal now part of the political discourse that he has really surfaced in politics. I don't know what he's going to do over the next 4 months, but this is the context that brought us to this particular moment.
I'm interested in the sort of the media landscape that some of our viewers might have no idea about. So political violence stems from emotion, right? And people are getting that from somewhere. So for people who are watching kind of mainstream, global, national news, they might not know what's out there. What are people consuming that is not news, that is opinion, that is mainstreaming conspiracy theories? Can you just characterize what people are consuming that might make them think about this kind of act?
I think that we are in an environment now where mainstream news is filled with violence and normalization of violence, but many, many more people are not getting their news from those sources, as you implied. Social media algorithms are tuned not for edification or education or advancing democracy. They're tuned for outrage. They are tuned to keep you on the app and to divide people and make people more and more angry, whether that's over an issue they legitimately care about, or whether it's messages that dehumanize the opposition or dehumanize groups of people like migrants or foreigners or Jews. So that is increasingly the currency of social media where people are getting their attention. However, within mainstream media and media coverage, the one act of political violence that we can't leave off the table in our discussion is January 6th. Right out here behind us on the ellipse, right before that speech, Donald Trump told his crowd that when the other side commits a fraud, you're allowed to play by very different rules. We know what that crowd went on to do. And a key part of his proposition now to the voting public is that the people who executed that riot, people died, cops were attacked, tried to mount a coup and overturn an election. We know all this, that's all history, is that those rioters are prisoners, political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, patriots who should be pardoned, and he has said that he will pardon them if he's elected. That's a long way of saying, in the context of the coverage that people are getting over and throughout the campaign, it's a context of normalization of violence. It's a context of normalizing a horrific coup attempt, really, which is what January 6th was, and saying that the people who executed it actually aren't violent criminals, they're actually heroes and prisoners of conscience. Donald Trump is running to be president and has the support of roughly half the public. That's an extraordinary message coming from somebody who would be the chief law enforcement officer of the United States.
And Caroline, just going back to this recent attack, it's being treated not just as an act of violence, but as an issue of national security. What is a Trump rally going to look like going forward?
Well, we've already, seen in the aftermath that law enforcement agencies have, acknowledged, look, there were some miscalculations. There's been reports that, Secret Service relied on local police units and local law enforcement agencies. And I think that it's going to be even more heightened. I mean, I think that too, I think that it kind of goes back to this whole discussion around political rhetoric and this, moment that we're seeing of heightened politics in our country, where you're seeing someone who almost assassinated the former president, not the first time that this has happened, but particularly now amid a lot of rising rhetoric. I think that this is going to continue to be heightened. I know that the U.S. Secret Service, Alejandro Mayorkas with the Homeland Security, have said that they are already taking steps to sort of ameliorate the situation. But I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but it's going to look different.
Okay, and just very briefly, if I can ask you both, the research is out there that suggests that if both sides believe the fate of the republic depends on the outcome, that violence increases. Are you personally worried about the next few months and what it might hold?
I think anybody who's paying attention to this election, to the rhetoric around it, again, primarily from Donald Trump and MAGA, but not exclusively, but primarily, and given the horrific events of the last week, has to be concerned about it. You'd be foolish to not be concerned about it. You should have been concerned about it from January 6th and even before. The concern is ongoing. This latest horrific act is a continuation of the rise in political violence. And yes, of course, it's a concern for the next few months.
Caroline?
I definitely think that this is going to be on the minds, particularly now with this, attempted assassination attempt. Looking at sort of the rhetoric. Also, it wasn't a couple, months ago that we were speaking about former president's comments about a bloodbath. And so I think that, it's going to be also interesting to see, how this feeds into his Trump supporters and where they go with this, because they're going to be looking to Trump for leadership. But of course, as Todd mentioned, there was also an attack on our Capitol not too long after some of his own rhetoric. So it's going to be interesting to see.
Okay, Caroline Vakil, Todd Zwillich, thank you so much for your insights. So the story of this election has a new chapter that no one wanted. It's looking unlikely that it will become a unifying moment. Join us next time as the story continues to unfold on Inside America.